a man named Thucydides, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, the war that took place between the two great powers of the Greek world, between the Spartans and their allies, and Athens and its allies. The Athens that fought this war against Sparta was an Athens at the height of its political power and prestige, under the leadership of its first citizen, Pericles, whose name is also up there at the very top. Under Pericles, Athens had built the famous Acropolis. It had established Athens as a mighty and redoubtable naval power, and it created an unprecedented level of artistic and cultural life, even today known simply as Periclean Athens. But Athens was also something completely unprecedented in the world. It was a democracy. And again, even today, the expression Athenian democracy connotes an ideal of the most complete form of democratic government that has ever existed. We are the school of Hellas. This is what Pericles boasts to his listeners in the famous funeral oration told by Thucydides. We throw our city open to the world and never exclude foreigners from any opportunity of learning and observing, even though the eyes of an enemy may profit from our liberality. Pericles boasts once again. The question maybe you want to ask about this is, how could the world's first, freest, and most open society sentence to death a man who spoke freely about his own ignorance and professed to care for nothing so much as virtue and human excellence? Now, at the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was just under 40 years of age, and we learn from the speech that Socrates was himself served in the military and served in defense of his country. The war, the Peloponnesian War, was fought, as you can see, over considerable length of time, on and off for almost a period of 30 years, and was concluded in the year 404 with the defeat of Athens and the installing of a pro-Spartan oligarchy, a pro-Spartan regime known as simply as the 30 Tyrants, also up there, who ruled Athens for a year. The next year, 403, the tyrants, the 30 as they were called, were driven out, and a democratic government was once again reestablished in Athens. Just 3 years later, 3 men named Anytus, Meletus, and Lycos, all of whom had been part of the democratic resistance movement against the Spartan oligarchy, these men brought charges against Socrates. Their charges against him were corrupting the young and disbelieving in the gods that the city believes in. So you can see that the charges were brought by people who were themselves, again, part of a democratic resistance movement. And the names of Anytus and Meletus, as you've read, appear in the speech itself. So the charges brought against Socrates did not simply grow out of thin air. Maybe we should rephrase the question. Not why did the Athenians bring Socrates to trial, but why did they permit him to carry on his practice of challenging the law and the authority of the law for as long as they did? Okay? Add to this the fact that when Socrates was brought to trial, again, the democracy had only recently been reestablished, but that many friends and former students of Socrates had been themselves implicated in the rule of the hated 30 tyrants. Among the members of the 30 were a man named Critias, There's actually a Platonic dialogue named after him, a man named Critias, who was a relative of Plato's, and another man named Charmides, whose also name is the title of a Platonic dialogue, Charmides, who was Plato's uncle. Plato himself, he tells us much later in life in his famous seventh letter, Plato himself was invited by his relatives to help to form a part of the government of the 30. And later Plato said that so abhorrent did they become that they made the older democracy look like the golden age. So the point I'm suggesting is that many of Socrates' students and associates, including Plato himself, had some connection with this oligarchical government that had ruled Athens for a brief time. And Socrates was himself not above suspicion. You often, don't we, even today, yes, we often judge teachers by their students, by the company they keep. Yes? Don't we? No one is above suspicion. Socrates himself had been a close associate of a man named Alcibiades, probably the most prominent Athenian in the generation after Pericles. Alcibiades was the man who engineered the disastrous Sicilian expedition and later ended his life as a defector going to Sparta. His complex relationship with Socrates is, by the way, recounted in the drunken speech that Alcibiades gives in Plato's Dialogue Symposium. So you can see that the trial of Socrates, the little speech that you have read, takes place in the shadow of military defeat, of resistance, of conspiracy, and betrayal. Socrates was 70 years old at the time of the trial. So this was a highly charged political environment, far more volatile than, for example, the kind of partisan quarrels we see today in our republic. I hope. Yeah. Okay? So let me talk about the accusations. Let me move from the political context of the speech to the accusations. And I say accusations because there are, as you read, if you read closely, you will see there were actually two sets of accusations leveled against Socrates. Early in the speech, Socrates claims that his current accusers, Anytus and Meletus, again, the democratic resistance fighters, have brought charges against, the charges they have brought against him are themselves the descendants of an earlier generation of accusers who were responsible for, he claims, maligning and creating an unfavorable prejudice against Socrates. These charges are not new, he tells the jury, and many members of the jury, he says, will have had formed an unfavorable opinion about him. This was the day before there were intense forms of jury selection where they would ask people, do you have a view of the case? Many of the jurors would have known Socrates, or certainly would have heard of him, and he says would have had already an unfavorable opinion formed about him by this earlier generation of accusers. Reference he makes to a comic poet. Yes, a comic poet. An unequivocal reference to the playwright Aristophanes, whose name I've had put up on the board. Aristophanes is the one who created the original or the initial prejudice against Socrates. What was that prejudice that Aristophanes, this comic poet, had created? The allusion to Aristophanes and the comic poet is a part of what Plato calls in Book 10 of the Republic, the old quarrel between philosophy and poetry. This quarrel is a staple of Plato's dialogues. It is a central theme not only of the symposium, in which Aristophanes and Socrates are actually shown at the same dinner table with one another, but it is also a key feature of the Republic, which we will be reading in a week, where Socrates offers an elaborate proposal for the censorship and control of poetry if it is to be made compatible with the demands of political justice. In fact, in a way, you cannot understand the Republic unless you understand the poetic backdrop to it and Socrates' long-standing engagement with the poetic tradition, and this back and forth between himself and the man he calls this comic poet. The core of this quarrel between the philosopher and the poet, between Socrates and Aristophanes, it's not just an aesthetic judgment, or it is not simply an aesthetic quarrel. It is, again, deeply political, or at least has something very political about it. It gets to the essence of the question of who is best equipped to educate future generations of citizens and civic leaders. Are the philosophers or are the poets, you might say, the true legislators for mankind, if you want to use Shelley's favorite, Shelley's dictum? Which one legislates for mankind? At the time of Socrates, the Greeks already had a centuries-long tradition of poetic education, going back centuries to the time of Homer and Hesiod, that set out certain exemplary models of heroic virtue and civic life. The Homeric epics were to the Greek world what the Bible is to